Imagine finding a ship, a large vessel, drifting silently across the open Atlantic Ocean. No damage, no signs of struggle. Food still sitting on the table, warm as if someone had just stepped away. And yet, not a single soul on board. This is not a story someone invented. This actually happened. The year is 1872. The world moved differently back then. Slower, quieter. Crossing an ocean meant weeks at sea. No radio, no signal, nothing but water and wind and the sound of the hull cutting through waves in the dark. For those who lived on the sea, a ship was everything. It was home. It was livelihood. It was life itself. And among the thousands of vessels that sailed in that era, one name would eventually be remembered above all others: the Mary Celeste. She was a brigantine, 282 tons of oak and iron, launched in 1861 off the coast of Nova Scotia, Canada. Nothing remarkable about her appearance. Two tall masts reaching into the sky. A sturdy hull that had crossed the Atlantic more times than anyone cared to count. But there was something about this ship, something that seemed to follow her. In the first 10 years of her life, the Mary Celeste had already changed hands several times. She had run aground on the rocks, suffered serious damage in a storm. One of her captains had died on her deck, and at one point, she was declared unseaworthy, stripped down, repaired, and quietly sold again. A ship that was never quite lucky. And yet, in November of 1872, one man decided to trust her. His name was Benjamin Spooner Briggs, 37 years old, a captain of considerable reputation, known for being calm, disciplined, and deeply religious. He came from a family of seafarers and had spent most of his life on the water. He was not a man who took risks lightly, but this voyage, he would not be making alone. Benjamin brought his wife with him, Sarah Elizabeth Cobb, a quietly strong woman who had learned long ago not to fear the sea, and their daughter, little Sophia Matilda, just 2 years old, barely old enough to walk steadily across a moving deck. This was not unusual for the time. Captains often brought their families on long voyages. A ship was home, after all. And Sarah, she was not afraid. In fact, just days before their departure, she wrote a letter to her mother. Her tone was light, easy, almost cheerful. "We have a fine ship," she wrote. "I hope this will be a pleasant voyage." No one knew. It was the last letter she would ever send. On the morning of November 5th, 1872, the Mary Celeste slipped quietly out of New York Harbor. Deep in her cargo hold lay something valuable, something volatile. 1,700 barrels of commercial-grade alcohol, consigned to a company in Genoa, Italy. Pure industrial spirit, sealed in oak barrels and stacked carefully below decks. Alcohol that could ignite. Alcohol that could expand in heat, in pressure, in the wrong conditions, and become something no one wanted to think about. But that morning, the sky was clear. The wind was favorable. The sea was calm. Captain Briggs stood on deck, watching the coastline of New York grow smaller and smaller, until it was nothing but a thin gray line on the horizon. Below him, Sarah had laid Sophia down for her morning rest, the child swaying gently with the rhythm of the ship, already half asleep. The crew numbered 7, all experienced, all handpicked by Briggs himself, men he trusted. Everything looked perfect. Everything felt safe. And as the Mary Celeste disappeared beyond the horizon that morning, no one standing on that harbor could have known. No one watching her sails grow small in the distance could have imagined that Benjamin Briggs would never return. that Sarah would never finish another letter, that little Sophia would never again feel solid ground beneath her feet. Not one of the 10 souls on board would ever be seen again. The Atlantic received them quietly and kept its answer to itself.
December 4th, 1872, the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. A sailor climbs to the lookout post of a passing ship, squints through the salt wind, and sees something that makes him go very, very still. A ship, drifting alone, with no one at the helm. The vessel that made the discovery was called the Dei Gratia. She had left New York just 8 days after the Mary Celeste, carrying a crew of 8 men and a cargo of petroleum bound for Gibraltar. Her captain was a man named David Morehouse, experienced, steady, and well-respected in the maritime world. And as it happened, David Morehouse knew Benjamin Briggs personally. The two captains had dined together just days before their ships departed. They had spoken of their routes, their cargo, their families. Morehouse had shaken Briggs's hand and wished him a safe passage. He had no reason to think it would be anything else. But now, on the afternoon of December 4th, one of Morehouse's crew spotted something on the horizon. A brigantine, 2 masts, moving strangely, not with the confidence of a vessel under command, but drifting, tilting slightly, wandering without purpose across the open sea. Morehouse raised his telescope. He recognized her almost immediately, the Mary Celeste. His first thought was that something must have gone wrong on board, a medical emergency perhaps, a fire below decks. He ordered his men to bring the Dei Gratia closer and called out across the water. No response. They called again, louder. The wind carried their voices out across the waves and brought nothing back. Morehouse sent 3 of his men across in a small boat. The first officer, Oliver DeVoe, led the boarding party. He had sailed for many years. He had seen storms, disasters, capsized vessels, and broken hulls. He was not a man easily unsettled, but what he found on the Mary Celeste unsettled him deeply. The ship was intact. No fire, no collision damage, no hole in the hull. She was wet from recent weather, but structurally sound. Her sails were partially set, some torn, some in order, as if she had been sailing and then simply forgotten how to stop. DeVoe moved carefully through the vessel. The cargo hold? All 1,700 barrels of alcohol, still stacked and sealed, untouched. The crew's quarters, personal belongings exactly where they had been left, clothing folded, boots sitting by the bunks, a sewing kit, needles still threaded, as if their owners had simply stepped out for a moment. The captain's cabin, Sarah Briggs' personal items on the small desk, a melodeon, a small keyboard instrument she had been playing on the voyage, sheet music still open on the stand, as if someone had paused mid-song, and little Sophia's toys, still arranged neatly on the shelf above her sleeping space. DeVoe stood there for a long moment. The ship was silent except for the creak of the hull and the sound of water moving gently below. In the galley, the stove was cold, but the last meal had been prepared. Food on the table, cups set out, a pot still on the hook above the stove, as if breakfast had been moments away from being served. And yet, not one living person was on board. Not the captain, not his wife, not the child, not a single one of the 7 crewmen. The only lifeboat was gone. But the ropes that would normally be used to lower it were still coiled neatly in place, undisturbed, as if the boat had not been lowered, but lifted away. DeVoe returned to the Dei Gratia. He stood before Captain Morehouse and gave his report quietly, methodically, the way a man speaks when he is trying very hard not to sound afraid. When he finished, the two men looked at each other in silence. 10 people, an entire ship, gone. The Mary Celeste was still seaworthy. Morehouse made the decision to sail her to Gibraltar as salvage, a difficult journey requiring him to split his already small crew across 2 vessels. And as the Dei Gratia and the Mary Celeste moved slowly across the Atlantic together, side by side through the gray December water, the questions had already begun. Where had they gone? Why had they gone? And why had they left so suddenly that a mother had not even stopped to gather her child's toys? When investigators finally boarded the Mary Celeste in Gibraltar, they expected to find answers. Instead, every single piece of evidence they found raised a new question, because nothing on that ship followed any logic they had ever seen before. The Mary Celeste arrived in Gibraltar on December 13, 1872. She was brought in by the salvage crew of the Dei Gratia, the men who had found her drifting alone in the Atlantic 9 days earlier. An official investigation was immediately ordered by the British Vice Admiralty Court, and so the work began. Investigators moved through every inch of the vessel, measuring, documenting, questioning. They were experienced men, methodical men, men who had seen maritime disasters of every kind. But as the days passed, the more they examined the Mary Celeste, the less anything made sense. The first thing they noted was the water. There was water in the lower hold, about 3.5 feet of it, sloshing slowly in the dark below the cargo. Enough to be concerning, but not nearly enough to sink a vessel of her size. A ship takes on water. That is not unusual. What was unusual was that the pumps were working perfectly. The crew could have cleared that water in under an hour. They had chosen not to, or they had not had the chance. The second thing was the lifeboat. It was gone. The only lifeboat the Mary Celeste carried had been taken. This much was already known, but investigators looked more closely at how it had been taken. The davits, the iron arms used to swing a lifeboat out and lower it into the sea, were still in their outward position, consistent with a boat being launched. But the ropes told a different story. They had not been carefully unwound and used to lower the boat down to the water. They were frayed, snapped, as if the lifeboat had been torn away or cut loose in tremendous haste, or simply ripped free by some force no one could explain. One investigator noted quietly in his report that it looked less like a planned evacuation and more like a desperate escape. The third thing was the cargo. All 1,700 barrels of alcohol, still sealed, still stacked, completely untouched. But when investigators counted the barrels more carefully, they found something odd. 9 barrels were empty. Not broken, not leaking, simply empty, as if their contents had been removed or had somehow evaporated. The remaining barrels were full and intact. The alcohol in those 9 barrels was never accounted for. The fourth thing was the navigation equipment. The ship's chronometer and sextant, the tools used to calculate position at sea, were missing. A captain does not leave without his navigation instruments. They are as essential as the wheel itself. Taking them suggested the crew had planned to go somewhere. But the last entry in the ship's log, dated November 25th, 9 days before she was found, placed the Mary Celeste near the Azores Islands, approximately 400 miles from where she was eventually discovered, which meant, for 9 full days, the ship had been sailing herself, with no one at the helm, somehow navigating open ocean alone, without striking another vessel, without running aground, without capsizing in the Atlantic swells, as if something or someone had been guiding her. The 5th thing was the sword. Found beneath the captain's bunk, an old cutlass with what appeared to be reddish-brown stains along the blade. Investigators sent it for examination. The results came back. The stains were not blood, but the fact that someone had felt the need to check lingered long after the report was filed. When the investigation concluded, the court at Gibraltar could not determine a cause. No crime could be proven. No accident could be confirmed. No explanation, reasonable or otherwise, could account for every piece of evidence simultaneously. The crew of the Dei Gratia were awarded salvage rights for the Mary Celeste, though the payment was suspiciously low, and the judge made no effort to conceal his feeling that Captain Morehouse and his men knew more than they were saying. But nothing was ever charged. Nothing was ever proven. And the Mary Celeste was quietly released back into service as if nothing had happened. As if 10 people had not simply ceased to exist somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. For over 150 years, people have been trying to explain what happened on the Mary Celeste. Scientists, historians, investigators, writers, all of them with different answers, none of them with the complete one.
When a mystery has no solution, the human mind does not rest. It reaches. It builds. It constructs explanations from the fragments it has been given, turning evidence over and over in the dark, like a stone that might reveal something different, if only you hold it at the right angle. And so, over the decades that followed the discovery of the Mary Celeste, the theories came, one by one, each one certain, at first, each one compelling, and each one falling just slightly short of explaining everything. The first theory was piracy. It was the most obvious, the most instinctive. Somewhere in the open Atlantic, another vessel had intercepted the Mary Celeste. Armed men had boarded her, killed or captured the crew, and taken what they wanted before vanishing back into the ocean. It was a reasonable theory, for about as long as it took to look at the evidence. Because pirates take cargo. The Mary Celeste's cargo, 1,700 barrels of valuable alcohol, was completely untouched. Not a single barrel removed. Not a single item of value taken from the cabins. Even the captain's money was still in his desk drawer. Whatever had happened on that ship, it was not a robbery. The second theory was mutiny. Perhaps the crew had turned on their captain. A dispute that escalated. Violence in the dark below decks. And then, the guilty men had taken the lifeboat and disappeared, leaving the ship behind as evidence of nothing they wanted to explain. But those who knew Benjamin Briggs dismissed this almost immediately. He was not a cruel captain. Not a man who provoked resentment. He had handpicked his crew himself, men he trusted, men who respected him. There was no record of conflict. No history of trouble between any of them. And beyond that, if the crew had mutinied and escaped, why had no one ever come forward? Not one man. Not one confession. Not one deathbed admission in all the years that followed. Mutiny leaves survivors. This left or nothing. The third theory was the cargo. 9 of the alcohol barrels were empty, their contents unaccounted for. Some researchers believed those 9 barrels had leaked, releasing vapor into the sealed cargo hold below decks. Alcohol vapor, in a confined space, reaches explosive concentrations quickly. A single spark, from the cook's stove, from a lantern, from metal striking metal in the dark, could have triggered a pressure explosion powerful enough to blow the hatch covers off and send a wall of force through the lower decks. Not enough to damage the ship's structure, but more than enough to terrify everyone on board. If the captain had believed the ship was about to explode, he might have made the decision to evacuate. Immediately, everyone into the lifeboat, tethered to the ship by a long rope, waiting at a safe distance until the danger passed. But if that rope had snapped, the lifeboat would have drifted away, and the Mary Celeste would have sailed on alone, leaving 10 people stranded in the open Atlantic with no way back. This theory is considered, by many researchers, to be the most plausible. And yet, it still does not explain everything, because no evidence of an explosion was ever found. No scorch marks. No burn damage. No displaced barrels. The cargo hold, when examined, was simply intact. The fourth theory was weather. A waterspout, a rotating column of water rising from the sea's surface like a tornado, had been spotted in that region of the Atlantic around the time of the Mary Celeste's last log entry. If a waterspout had passed directly over or near the vessel, the sound alone would have been terrifying. A roar like nothing the crew had ever heard. Water rising in great spinning walls around the ship. Instruments behaving strangely. The compass spinning. Perhaps the captain had believed the ship was sinking. Perhaps the order to abandon ship had been given in sheer panic, and the ocean had done the rest. The fifth theory was the one that no serious investigator would write down officially. But that did not stop people from saying it quietly in the years that followed. The sea itself had taken them. Not a storm. Not an explosion. Not pirates or mutiny or accident. Something older. Something that had always lived in the deep Atlantic water, patient, and very, very quiet. Something that had simply reached up. This theory has no evidence, but it has never entirely gone away. Because here is what every theory struggles with in the end. 10 people vanished from a sound, seaworthy vessel in calm weather, leaving behind every possession, every provision, every reason to stay. The ship sailed herself for 9 days across open ocean. And not one body, not one piece of wreckage, not one trace of any human being was ever found. What if the mystery was never really a mystery? What if someone already knew the answer and had decided, very deliberately, that no one else ever would? When the Mary Celeste arrived in Gibraltar under salvage, The man responsible for investigating her was Frederick Solly Flood. He was the Attorney General for Gibraltar, a senior legal figure, a man of considerable authority and, by all accounts, considerable ego. From the very first day he stepped aboard that silent ship, Flood was convinced of one thing. This was not an accident. This was a crime. And he was certain he knew who was responsible. Captain David Morehouse, the man who had found the Mary Celeste drifting in the Atlantic, the man who had sailed her to Gibraltar and claimed salvage rights, the man who, Flood kept reminding everyone, had dined with Benjamin Briggs just days before both ships departed New York. Flood's theory was this: Morehouse and Briggs had conspired together. They had arranged for the Mary Celeste to be a founder at sea so that Morehouse could claim the salvage reward, a sum that, split between the two captains, would have been worth a great deal of money. The crew of the Mary Celeste, in this version of events, had simply been removed, silenced, disposed of somewhere in the cold Atlantic water before the day Glacier came alongside. It was, in its way, a logical theory. Except for one thing. There was no evidence. Not a drop of it. The reddish stains on the sword found beneath Briggs' bunk had already been tested and confirmed to be rust, not blood. The marks on the ship's railing that Flood had insisted were evidence of an axe attack were re-examined by independent analysts and identified as the result of ordinary wear and weather damage. Every piece of physical evidence Flood presented dissolved under scrutiny. And yet, the salvage award granted to Morehouse and his crew was suspiciously, almost insultingly low. A fraction of what they were legally entitled to. The judge presiding over the case made no secret of his suspicion, even as he admitted, openly, that suspicion was all he had. No charges were ever filed. No crime was ever proven. But the cloud of suggestion that Flood placed over David Morehouse never entirely lifted. For the rest of his career, the man who had found the Mary Celeste was quietly regarded, in certain maritime circles, as someone who knew more than he had said. Whether that was true, no one ever found out. There was one other detail that investigators noted and then, strangely, never followed up on. The Mary Celeste's cargo manifest listed 1,700 barrels of commercial alcohol. But the company that had loaded that cargo, Meissner Ackerman and Company, had a complicated financial history. There were quiet rumors, never proven, that some of the barrels in the hold had not contained what the manifest claimed. That the cargo, or part of it, had been misrepresented. That someone, somewhere along the line, had something to hide long before the ship ever left New York Harbor. If the cargo itself was the source of a secret, then perhaps the disappearance of the crew was not the beginning of the story. Perhaps it was the end of one. A story that had started on dry land. In an office. Behind a desk, with a pen and a ledger and a number that didn't quite add up. We will never know, because no one ever looked hard enough. Or perhaps someone looked, and then decided, very quietly, to look away. The Mary Celeste did not rest after Gibraltar. She was repaired, recrewed, and returned to service, because a ship is a valuable thing, and the sea does not care about the stories told on shore. She changed hands many times over the following years. Owner after owner. route after route. And with each new voyage are a new crew who knew what ship they were sailing and chose to sail her anyway. She was never lucky. Repairs were costly. Cargo was lost. Business ventures built around her failed, one after another, as if the ship herself resisted being made useful. In January 1885, just over 12 years after her crew had vanished, the Mary Celeste ran aground on a coral reef off the coast of Haiti. Her captain at the time was a man named Gilman Parker. And the investigation that followed suggested, quietly, that the grounding had not been an accident. That Parker had intentionally wrecked the ship in order to claim the insurance money on the cargo. The cargo, when examined, turned out to be largely worthless goods: cat food, rubber boots, old bread, insured far beyond their actual value. Parker was charged with fraud. But before the case could reach its conclusion, he died. And the Mary Celeste, broken on the reef and beyond saving, slowly sank into the shallow Caribbean water, where she remained, undisturbed, for over a century. Her wreck was found in 2001 by a team of underwater explorers. She was lying on her side in shallow water off the Haitian coast, her hull broken open, her timbers scattered across the reef by 116 years of current and tide. There was nothing left to tell her story, only the shape of her, the outline of what she had once been. A ghost of a ghost, resting quietly on the ocean floor in the warm Caribbean blue. And the crew? Benjamin Briggs, Sarah, little Sophia Matilda, just 2 years old. The 7 men who had been handpicked for a voyage that should have been routine. They were never found. No bodies. No wreckage from the lifeboat. No message washed ashore in a bottle. No record of any of them appearing anywhere, under their own names or any other, after the morning of November 25, 1872. They had simply ceased, as completely and as quietly as a candle going out in a dark room. The Mary Celeste remains, to this day, one of the most thoroughly investigated maritime mysteries in history. Hundreds of researchers, dozens of official inquiries, books, documentaries, theories published in academic journals and debated in maritime courts. And still, no answer. Not one that holds together completely. Not one that explains every piece of evidence without leaving something else unexplained. Perhaps that is the nature of certain mysteries. Not puzzles waiting to be solved, but doors that were never meant to be opened. Some things happen at sea, in the dark, far from any shore. And the ocean keeps them. Quietly. Completely. Forever. The water is still now. The ship is gone. The people are gone. The questions remain. But they are soft questions, tonight. Distant ones. Let them drift. Like a ship with no one at the helm. Moving slowly through dark water. Under a sky full of stars. Going somewhere no one will ever quite reach. Rest now. The ocean has you. And the ocean is very, very calm.